Cyberpunk 2077 has a ton of hidden features. Just recently, I showed you some of the new and secretly added things with patch 1.6, things that did not make it into the patch notes. But in the comments of that video, there's a lot of people wondering about all of those other secret or hidden things, not just from patch 1.6. So in this video, I'm going to highlight a variety of things that you probably didn't know about Cyberpunk 2077. Some of these will be incredibly simple and basic, but also quite a few that are a bit more complex. And I'll bet for the vast majority of you, if you watch through this entire video, at least one of these things will be new to you, as actually some of them were new to me as I was making the video. And looking at some of the stats of my recent videos, I've realized a ton of you guys are subscribed. Kind of makes it hard to beg for subscribers when so many of you are already subscribed, so if some of you could unsubscribe, that would be perfect. Starting things off, one simple one that has been a complete game changer for me, or for those of you that hate the dialogue of Cyberpunk. Are you somebody who is constantly using the skip dialogue feature? I'm not here to judge you for playing the game wrong, but if you do use this often, you'll notice that you have to constantly be hitting the skip key, because it's only actually skipping one line at a time, or alternatively, to be much faster, there's a setting in the game where you can switch to dialogue skipping to be continuous, making it so you just hold down the skip key and it will continuously skip through all of the dialogue until it's your turn to talk. This can be particularly handy when skipping dialogue at a vendor who always seems to have a ton to say, despite me just wanting a weapon. One of the most notable quests in all of Cyberpunk 2077 is the Pickup. This being that quest where you go into the Maelstrom base during Act 1 of the game, and it actually does have several secret options around it. There are a ton of outcomes to this quest in general, probably the most of any quest in Cyberpunk, but if you do make a variety of special choices during this, and really the most passive choices available, you'll actually unlock this special Maelstrom weapon vendor. There's a few criteria you'll have to hit to get this. First off, you're going to actually have to pay 10,000 eddies to get this flathead for yourself. This is going to pop up early on when you're talking to Jackie. You can suggest to pay for things yourself. Of course, you actually need the money to pay for things yourself though. And later on, and much more importantly, while you're actually in the Maelstrom base, you must offer a peaceful route to restructure the deal and pay them 10,000 eddies. Next up, you need to not take the chip from Meredith Stout, which the simplest way of doing that is just to never call Meredith. Throughout the entirety of your time in All Foods, you cannot point a weapon at anyone or really make any threats at all. When you have the option to attack or threaten Royce, you have to wait it out or you will ruin getting the vendor. Like I said, you have to be completely pacifist here. And lastly, when Jackie refuses to sit down and things get all tense, you must tell him to sit down. And if you do all of these things successfully, your time in All Foods will actually be quite smooth and everyone will leave pretty happy. And immediately after finishing this quest, you will discover a totally new Maelstrom vendor at All Foods, and you can freely use him for the rest of the game. He is largely a basic vendor. He does have quite a few melee weapons for sale, but otherwise pretty similar to other vendors. Although he is one of the most convenient vendors to use if you are skipping time. In Cyberpunk 2077, vendor stock will refresh if you wait for 72 hours. And with this particular vendor, you can actually stand right next to him while you're waiting. A lot of other ones will block this action because you're inside their little shop, but not this one. So if you are looking for something specific, whether it be one of the new weapons added or even just a weapon mod, this could be a really good vendor to spend some time waiting at. But also during this quest, you're able to get a unique chem. Do you remember that moment when you're sitting here and Dum Dum offers you a hit of his inhaler? Well, if you chose the Street Kid life path, you're actually going to have a special dialogue option here, and you could do a little rapport building with Dum Dum.
Escape. Pure as baby powder.
Black lace. Tough to get your hands on. Gotta have a good source.
It doesn't matter if you actually choose to take a hit from the inhaler or not after that, but you do have to continue to side with the Maelstrom. You can either go a completely passive route like I did and I showed you earlier in this video, or if you do have Militech attack the base, you have to help the Maelstrom fend them off. But then in the end, when Dum Dum is walking you out of All Foods, he'll actually offer you his inhaler, and you'll be able to get the Black Lace item for yourself. This is going to be a new one-time use aid item that will actually boost your armor by 10. Definitely not the most powerful item in the game, and it is literally a one-time use. So once you use this thing, it is gone forever. Definitely an interesting choice by CDPR, but it is one of the few unique interactions you can get by choosing a different life path in game. But speaking of rare content that you can lock yourself out of, did you punch this weird guy Fingers? So Fingers is one of the Ripper docks just off of Jig Jig Street in Japantown. And he is notable because this is the only Ripper dock in all of Night City where you can buy epic quality leg cyberware, which is the highest tier. For one reason or another, there actually aren't legendary variants of some of the leg cyberware or the eye cyberware. And one of the things he sells, the epic fortified ankles, are a bit unique. You get fortified ankles at other places, but this particular variant, the epic variant, will allow you to do the boosted jump and then allow you to hover in midair briefly. You can almost fly around for a little while after jumping and can even stabilize it by aiming to get a perfect midair shot off. The problem being, you will encounter Fingers during the main quest known as Disaster Piece, where you must interrogate him, and you could punch him here. As I mentioned earlier, if you punch him, you lock access to this fender permanently, meaning you can never get epic fortified ankles, at least not legitimately. But you actually have two options to get around this. Either A, don't punch him, or B, you can actually go to Fingers and buy these two epic quality leg cyberware before doing the Disaster Piece quest. You gain access to this vendor right at the start of Act 2, so you could buy these and then punch him, and then it really won't matter, which definitely seems like the best outcome, because punching him, very satisfying. But okay, then how about some discounts? There's this Ripper Doc named Charles in Watson. He's located here on the map. Upon normal entry, it just seems like a normal Ripper Doc, but if you run around the back of the building, you're going to find a door and it'll kick off the last login quest. Without spoiling too much of this, you'll discover that this Ripper Doc has some sketchy stuff going on in his basement, and after progressing through the quest, you can actually come back upstairs and confront Charles. He's going to give you an explanation as to what is going on, but in the dialogue, you can choose to call him a liar, not believing his explanation. And upon doing so, he's going to give you a 20% discount to keep quiet. You can choose to take this or not, but I personally choose to take this, because then from here on out, you're going to permanently have a 20% cheaper Ripper Doc in Night City, which will make him the cheapest in Night City. Cyberpunk 2077 is a game where you can truly create whatever type of character you want, including editing things like your breast size. Well, a revelation that's going to be devastating for many of you is whatever breast size you pick doesn't actually matter. In Cyberpunk, regardless of what chest size you pick, whether that be big, default, or small, the clothing in the game will always use the default sizing. So all of the various shirts and tops for the female body type use the default chest size, regardless of what you chose. I could already hear many of you crying in the background. How could CDPR lie to you? How could they betray you like this? But don't worry, there are a ton of mods out there on PC that can change this, unsurprisingly. But speaking of clothing, something else you may notice is some of the items in game do have ingrained special abilities. In earlier versions of Cyberpunk, you basically just wanted clothing to have as many mod slots as possible. You would stack armadillo mods and become all-powerful as a result. But with patch 1.5, things were reworked quite a bit. So now you may notice that some of the clothing in your inventory, even if it's legendary, actually has less mod slots than ideal, having less than 2 mod slots. Or even some have 0 mod slots at all. Well, those items aren't just by default trash, as they probably have an inherent ability to them. Like in this Corpo shirt, you can see it only has 1 mod slot, but the shirt itself with no mods will give me several resistances to a bunch of different damage types. There's going to be all kinds of different armor that will apply with this. A lot of these set armors, like the solo armors or the media armors, have a chance at spawning like this, although it does seem to be somewhat random, so it'll vary from one save to another. But just overall, make note of this. When you're actually looking at items in game, having 2 mod slots isn't necessarily the best, because some things may have a different bonus to them that could be more valuable to you, or could not be. A lot of the time, 2 mod slots is still king, but just something to keep in mind. But something else that is kind of a weird quirk of this game is you actually aren't killing enemies a lot of the time. In my testing, around 50% of the time in normal gameplay, you don't actually take out the enemy, you just knock them out. You are effectively doing non-lethal damage to them. And you can visually see this. They'll be squirming on the ground, and as you hover over them, your crosshair will turn red. This means they are still alive, and we definitely can't have that. There's a couple of reasons this could happen. One of the main reasons is the final shot that downed that enemy, if it is to a body or even just a limb in general, and not a headshot, the enemy likely survived. So depending on where you shoot enemies with the final blow, it'll actually be relevant to whether or not they survive in the end. But even further, if you do have Kuroshi optics, this will make it so your shots are non-lethal, as well as the PAX mod for weapons will make shots non-lethal. The reason this is all relevant though is these enemies do have bounties and street cred on them. The only way to actually collect those bounties or get that street cred is to finish them off completely. When they're in this downed state, they don't actually reward you that. So in particular with the early game, if you're trying to get up your street cred or trying to get some more money, finishing off some of the enemies could be a good thing. But what will likely end up being the most valuable tip in this entire video, do you ever get frustrated when your car for some reason spawns down the block and has to drive to you, or even spawns up on a bridge far away from you? Well, to avoid that, when you spawn your car or when you call it, just jump. So I'm sure many of you already know this. It's a very common thing. It's basically been a feature since day one. But for whatever reason, when you jump and call your car, it'll spawn much closer to you, like right next to you. It's always been a thing. You'll probably just get into second nature of always jumping when you actually call for your vehicle, and it's an interesting quirk of Cyberpunk. In a similar vein, in Cyberpunk 2077, if you do have the double jump cyberware, you can double jump in mid-air to avoid fall damage. So basically jump off whatever ledge you are jumping from and then jump halfway down, and then you'll take no fall damage because it resets on that second jump. In your car in Cyberpunk, you can change the radio station by just tapping the radio key. So on PC, you just tap the R key and it'll go to the next station. I always see people opening up this full menu, but if you don't want to, you don't have to do that. You can just tap the key and cycle through the stations, almost like people do in a real car. Have you ever noticed, especially in the early game of Cyberpunk, how a bunch of the gigs on your map don't have real descriptions? It just describes some aspect about it being a gig in Night City. Well, if you actually go to the fixer of that district and talk to them, it'll populate all of these gigs with their objectives, what type of gig they actually are. It's pretty small, but it's also kind of handy, especially if you just happen to be passing by a fixer in the earlier half of the game, because some of these gigs I just don't enjoy doing, and other ones are a bit more fun. Another notable change that came to gigs with patch 1.5 is how to get all of the gigs. There was a gig tier system added in, so now basically for each of the fixers in the game, you have to do a certain number of earlier gigs before you unlock some later ones. So on your map right now, if you're in the earlier half of the game, you probably don't have all of the gigs already. You have to do some first, then you'll get more, higher tier ones. And this actually applies to some of the DLC gigs. There are new gigs added with patch 1.6, and to get some of these, you actually have to do some earlier gigs for those fixers. Weapon and armor mods can be a massive buff to your character in Cyberpunk. The best mods in general are Armadillo for armor, because it just increases your armor, but also Crunch for weapons, which will make it so your weapons deal more damage per shot. The way you actually get these has changed a ton over the years of this game. For weapon mods, you can actually find them at weapon vendors. Weapon vendors might have a couple in stock and you could just buy them. Armor mods are no longer sold by clothing vendors though. You have to find these in the world. But as you cycle through weapons and armors, you'll probably want a lot of these mods. So the best way to do that is to craft them. And the way to find the crafting recipe is you kind of don't. They changed this also quite a bit over the past couple of updates, where right now in Cyberpunk, crafting recipes are completely randomized. So if you want to unlock the crafting recipe for Armadillo, you might find a ton of guides online, but those won't necessarily apply to your game. The crafting recipe is just going to spawn in a box somewhere. You may find a few at some of the NCPD scanner hustles. These tend to have some kind of recipe, but not always. But in general, if you're trying to figure this out, unfortunately, it's kind of a crapshoot. This is just the way CDPR has changed their game over time. The left alt key on PC, as well as down on the numpad on consoles, will cycle your headlights. You can choose these from being off, on, or your brights. And in some vehicles, your brights are actually really bright. They can be genuinely helpful. There's an alternate way to dodge in Cyberpunk. Instead of double tapping the move key, you can double tap the crouch key, which is actually very handy for PC players because you are able to rebind the crouch key. There's technically two of these in game, and either one works for dodging. You either have the toggle or the hold to crouch key. And the way I typically do this is I rebind the toggle to crouch key to a more accessible button, like one of the buttons on my mouse. And then I just double tap that button. I'll crouch briefly, but I'll also be able to consistently trigger the dodge. It's just a much easier way to trigger this, especially with some of the cyberware that depend on it. With one of the recent updates, they made it so Gorilla Arms will actually increase your body stat. It's actually said it does this since day one, but with patch 1.5, it was actually implemented. This will benefit all of the skill checks in game, including weapons, although it won't actually tell you it does. So right here in game, my body stat with Gorilla Arms is high enough to actually use this weapon at its full potential, but it won't show that. But it does actually work. I am using the weapon at its full potential. It's a bit odd. It's something I would definitely like to see changed more properly in the future. It does work when ripping off things like turrets. It will show you have enough to actually rip off the turret. But last but not least, something that's going to be incredibly obvious to most of you, but then a complete game changer to some others, is quick hacking. For PC users, to quick hack in Cyberpunk, you hold down the tab key, and you have to hold this down the entire time you're quick hacking. Or you could just hit the caps lock key. This is one of those things that I actually didn't discover till about a couple of months of playing this game, and it is a complete game changer. Rather than having to hold a key down, you just hit caps lock and it'll enter into the quick hacking screen, and then you hit caps lock again and it'll exit whenever you're done. It's definitely much more convenient to use, and although again, I'm sure 95% of you knew this, I do hope that other 5% is a little mind blown right now. Either way, those are 20 secret features or interactions in Cyberpunk 2077, ranging from relatively simple to a bit more complex and secret outcomes. There's actually a bunch more. I had a full list, about 45, but I just did not have enough time to include them all in this video. And let me know in the comments, was this helpful? Did you learn anything new as a result of this, or did I miss anything? Are there any other secret features that you feel like I should highlight? I definitely will have another episode of this coming in the future. As always, again though, I thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, but with that, I hope to see you all next time. Later.